Everyone thinks they know the HEMI story. Massive power, iconic orange paint, muscle car glory days. But what if I told you the HEMI engine almost never happened? That Chrysler engineers had to fight tooth and nail just to get this beast approved, and that the military had more to do with its creation than any drag strip ever did? Stick around because today we're diving deep into the real story behind America's most legendary engine. And trust me, what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about the HEMI. Here's something that'll blow your mind: the HEMI wasn't born in Detroit, and it definitely wasn't designed for street racing. In fact, the first HEMI engines came to life in 1951, and they were built for something totally different than burning rubber. After World War II, Chrysler's engineers were sitting on a gold mine of knowledge from building aircraft engines. These guys had spent years developing high-performance power plants for military planes, and when the war ended, they weren't about to let all that expertise go to waste. The hemispherical combustion chamber design wasn't new. European manufacturers had been messing around with the concept since the early 1900s. But Chrysler engineer Tom Hoover and his team saw something everyone else missed. They realized that a true hemispherical design could solve one of the biggest problems plaguing engines at the time: inefficient combustion. The genius was in the simplicity. By creating a dome-shaped combustion chamber, they could position the valves at opposing angles, allowing for larger valves and better airflow. More air and fuel meant bigger explosions, and bigger explosions meant more power. It's basic physics, but nobody had executed it quite like this before. The first HEMI, the 331 cubic inch firepower V8, rolled out in 1951 Chrysler models. It was putting out 180 horsepower when most V8s were barely cracking 160. Doesn't sound like much today, but back then? That was serious grunt. Now here's where things get really interesting, and this is the part of the HEMI story that doesn't get talked about enough. Before the HEMI became the king of the street, it absolutely demolished the competition on the racetrack. NASCAR in the 1950s was a totally different animal. We're talking about stock cars that were actually stock, running on dirt tracks and beach courses. When Chrysler started dropping HEMI engines into their race cars in 1951, it was like bringing a machine gun to a knife fight. Between 1951 and 1954, HEMI-powered Chryslers won the NASCAR Grand National Championship 3 times. Lee Petty, the patriarch of America's first family of racing, piloted a HEMI to victory after victory. But here's the kicker: NASCAR actually started changing rules specifically to slow down the HEMI. That's how dominant it was. The engine was so good that other manufacturers started crying foul. They claimed Chrysler had an unfair advantage. And you know what? They were absolutely right. The HEMI could rev higher, make more power, and stay reliable longer than anything Ford or GM had in their arsenal. But racing success came with a price tag. HEMI engines were expensive to build and complicated to maintain. The hemispherical heads required a complex valve train with multiple rocker arms and pushrods. While your average mechanic could rebuild a small block Chevy in his garage with basic tools, the HEMI required specialized knowledge and equipment. Alright, so you're probably wondering when the HEMI became the street-brawling monster we all know and love. Well, that didn't happen until 1964, and the story behind it is absolutely wild. By the early 1960s, Chrysler had actually discontinued the first-generation HEMI. It was too expensive to produce, too complicated for average owners to maintain, and the company's new wedge-head engines were making respectable power for a fraction of the cost. But then something happened that changed everything: the muscle car wars exploded. Ford had just dropped the Mustang, and suddenly every teenager in America wanted a fast, affordable performance car. GM was cooking up the GTO, and Chrysler executives realized they needed something big to compete. They needed a flagship engine that would cement their reputation as the performance king. Enter the 426 HEMI, and this beast was different from anything that came before. The second-generation HEMI was designed from day one to be an absolute monster. We're talking 425 horsepower and street trim, though everyone knew the real number was way higher. Chrysler was sandbagging the ratings to keep insurance companies and regulators off their backs. When the 426 HEMI debuted at Daytona in 1964, it didn't just win. It took the top 3 positions. Richard Petty put his HEMI-powered Plymouth in victory lane with an average speed of over 154 miles per hour. For context, that was nearly 10 miles per hour faster than the previous year's winner. Here's something you've got to understand about owning a HEMI back in the day, and this is crucial to understanding why these engines are so legendary today. The 426 Street HEMI wasn't just powerful. It was temperamental, expensive, and required constant attention. Mechanics called it the elephant because it was big, heavy, and took up a ton of space under the hood. If you ordered a Hemi in your 1968 Roadrunner or Charger, you weren't getting a turnkey street machine. You were getting a barely civilized race engine that happened to have license plates. The engine needed high-octane fuel, frequent valve adjustments, and it idled so rough that stoplights became an exercise in patience. But here's why people loved it anyway: when you stomped on that gas pedal, nothing else mattered. The Hemi would light up the tires in first, second, and sometimes third gear. It was savage, unfiltered automotive violence, and it was glorious. The price tag told you everything you needed to know. Adding the Hemi option to your Dodge or Plymouth cost around $850 in 1970, which was serious money. For context, you could buy a brand new Volkswagen Beetle for about $2,000 back then. People were spending almost half the cost of an entire car just to get the Hemi engine. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into American muscle, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. We've got tons more content coming on legendary engines, restoration projects, and the golden age of American performance. Trust me, you don't want to miss what we've got planned. Now we come to the part of the story that still hurts a little bit. The Hemi's reign came to a brutal end in 1971, and it wasn't because the engine wasn't good enough. Far from it. The early 1970s brought a perfect storm of problems for muscle cars. Insurance companies started jacking up rates for high-performance vehicles. Young guys who could afford the car payment suddenly couldn't afford the insurance. Some insurance companies flat-out refused to cover Hemi cars. Then came the emissions regulations. The Clean Air Act meant manufacturers had to seriously reduce harmful emissions, and big, powerful engines like the Hemi were the first casualties. The cost of developing the Hemi to meet new standards just didn't make business sense when sales were already plummeting. And finally, the oil crisis hit. When gas prices shot up and supplies got tight, suddenly nobody wanted a car that could barely get 8 miles per gallon. The muscle car party was over. Chrysler built the last 426 Hemi in 1971. Just like that, one of the greatest engines ever designed disappeared from the lineup. Only about 11,000 street Hemis were ever built during the engine's entire production run, which is why original Hemi cars command absolutely insane prices today. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, and honestly, this might be the most important chapter in the entire Hemi saga. For over 30 years, the Hemi name was retired. Chrysler built some decent engines in the 80s and 90s, but nothing carried that legendary orange paint and iconic valve covers. The Hemi became this mythical thing that old guys talked about at car shows while younger enthusiasts wondered what all the fuss was about. But in 2003, Chrysler did something bold. They brought back the Hemi name with a completely modern engine. This new 5.7-liter Hemi used advanced technology like variable valve timing and multi-displacement systems, but it kept a hemispherical combustion chamber design that made the original so special. Now, purists lost their minds. They said it wasn't a true Hemi, that Chrysler was just using the name to sell trucks and SUVs to people who didn't know any better. And you know what? They had a point. The modern Hemi compromised some of the original design principles for fuel efficiency and emissions compliance. But here's what those critics missed: the new Hemi introduced an entirely new generation to this legendary engine design. Kids who'd never heard of Richard Petty or the Superbird suddenly knew what a Hemi was because their dad's Ram pickup had one. The name was alive again. So where does all this leave us in 2024? The Hemi story has come full circle in the most bittersweet way possible. Dodge just announced that 2024 is the last year for Hemi-powered Challengers and Chargers. After more than 20 years of the modern Hemi era, Stellantis is moving toward electrification and turbocharged inline-six engines. Sound familiar? It's almost the exact same story as 1971, just with different villains. But here's the thing about the Hemi: it's bigger than any one engine or any one era. The Hemi represents American engineering at its most ambitious and unapologetic. It's the idea that more power is always better, that efficiency is secondary to raw performance, and that sometimes the impractical choice is the right choice. Original Hemi cars from the muscle car era are now selling for ridiculous money. A numbers-matching 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda can fetch over $1 million at auction. Even clapped-out project cars with Hemi engines command six-figure prices. These aren't just cars anymore, they're rolling pieces of American history. The modern Hemi era created its own legends too. The Hellcat, the Demon, the Red Eye, these are cars that took the Hemi philosophy and dialed it up to absolutely absurd levels. 700 horsepower? 800? Why not 1,000? Because if the Hemi taught us anything, it's that there's no such thing as too much power. What makes the HEMI truly special isn't just the engineering or the horsepower numbers. It's what the engine represents. In a world that increasingly values efficiency over excitement and practicality over passion, the HEMI stood for something different. It was loud, proud, and completely uncompromising. Whether you're Team Original or you love the modern versions, whether you think Stellantis should keep building them or you understand the business reality, one thing is certain: the HEMI changed everything. It set a standard that every American performance engine has been chasing for over 70 years. Thanks for riding along on this journey through HEMI history. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure you're subscribed because we've got a ton more content coming on the cars and engines that built America. Drop a comment below and tell me your favorite HEMI-powered car. Are you a Superbird guy? Road runner? Or maybe you're all about that Hellcat life? Until next time, keep the rubber on the road and the HEMI under the hood. I'll see you in the next one.